My name is Blanca Romero. I had the privilege of growing up in different countries. My father was a diplomat, so we traveled and moved every 3 to 4 years. That gave me a lot of exposure to different societies, different cultures, different backgrounds, people from different areas and different ways of thinking. I spent quite a bit of time in South America, in different countries in South America, as well as in the US. I did my high school in Texas, and that had I would say, a big cultural impact. My grandmother is a very religious person. However, my mom is somewhat religious. My father was an agnostic Catholic, so I was brought up in the Roman Catholic faith. I did not go to religious schools until high school, in which I did go to a Roman Catholic high school. My entire life I had questions. So when the age of 6 came in Roman Catholicism, you do what is called the First Communion. And my mom wanted me to wait until I was a little bit older so I could understand what the meaning of that was, which is accepting Jesus into your heart as your Savior and Lord. And when I was 9, she put me in classes to prepare me for my First Communion. At that age, I had begun questioning things, and I needed answers. My religious teacher could not provide those answers and would become quite flustered and frustrated. And I would continue seeking. I became a little disheartened by the fact that I was not getting the answers I needed. So I told my mother I did not want to have a First Communion. And that was heartbreaking for her. But I felt I could not accept something if I was not satisfied with it. So I continued questioning until I was 12. When I was 12, I started questioning the existence of God. No longer was I questioning the faith I was being brought up in, but I was questioning His existence as a whole. One of the biggest questions for me was the question of the Trinity, how it was possible to have God be one, but be three. And I did a lot of research even in high school when they did put me in a Catholic school, a move which they did for 2 reasons. It was a very good school, and they also wanted to solidify the faith within me. I studied the teachings of St. Thomas of Aquinas, who did extensive writing on the Trinity and the concept and belief of the Trinity. Nothing was satisfactory. Many questions I had. I had questions about fasting, for example. We have a period of Lent before Easter in which traditionally we were supposed to fast for 40 days, and it had turned into giving up meat on Fridays or giving up, anything that you enjoyed, such as chocolate, for 40 days. So my questioning was, why is this happening? Why are we not following what the Bible says that we should be following? As I grew up and matured and read more, my questions became a little more complex. I began to question the teachings in Catholicism about our prophets. To me, a prophet had to be a perfect, if not almost perfect being, someone that I would aspire to emulate and try to become like that person. Yet, reading the Bible, the way that prophets such as Noah and Prophet Lot are portrayed was shocking. Some of the stories, and we never hear about that. When you're growing up, you go to church and you go to the concept that we have here of Sunday school. You don't hear those stories. You don't hear about them until you begin to read the actual book. And when you start asking questions, the answer that I would get is, don't worry about that. Let's look at this. or, oh, that was a mistake in the Bible. It will get corrected. And that was another thing for me, was how can there be so many versions of a holy book when, if we're created by God, He would tell us how to live, right? And how to gain nearness to Him. And there was contradictions within the book I had to read. And there was contradictions between my Bible and the next person's Bible. So those are a few examples of the questions that were unanswered. When I was in high school, I kept this more private. When I was a little younger and I was in middle school in Argentina, actually, I had a world religions teacher. That was a British school, actually. It was not a Catholic school. It was more of an Anglican school. And I had a fantastic world religions teacher that was the first time that I heard about Islam in an academic setting. And I found everything he said fascinating. I was 12 years old. And I would speak to him about my questions and my doubts. And he told me that growing up, he had also had questions and doubts, but he had, relied on his community to guide him back to Christianity. I didn't have the same outcome. In university, began attending different churches. I was really looking for guidance. And I thought maybe if it's not in Roman Catholicism, it will be in, the Episcopalian Church or the Southern Methodist Church or a non-denominational church. And I began to attend services in different churches and different settings, speaking to different people, speaking to pastors. And I could not put my heart at ease in any of those. So I just continued reading the Bible. Now, I met different Muslims in completely different places, whether it was an accounting class or in a psychology class. And I would, somehow or another, a conversation would veer towards them telling me about Islam. And I almost felt like Islam was coming at me from different directions, but that was not a place that I was willing to look into. So one day at a gathering at one of my Muslim friends' homes, I saw the Quran sitting on the shelf, and I asked if I could read it. I took the Quran in my hands and I opened it to Surah Taha. And the second ayah of the surah says, "We have not sent down the Quran to you that you may be distressed." And that really spoke to me. I was going through a difficult time personally, and I continued reading. I couldn't put it down. And, the gathering went on, people were socializing, and I was sitting on the sofa reading the Quran. And so one of my friends got annoyed and said, "Just put it back," took it from my hands. That night, I dreamt of every ayah that I had read. And it scared me so much. I wanted nothing to do with studying anything with the Quran for a while. But it sparked something inside. And a few months later, a friend of mine mentioned offhandedly that they were going to the masjid for Muharram. I asked, "What is Muharram?" So, don't worry, they kind of dismissed my question. I asked again, and they told me the story of Imam Hussein. And by the end of the story, I was in tears. They could not understand what had happened inside me or why I would have any feelings towards a group of people that I had no idea about and no attachment to. They left to go to the mosque, and I quickly went online and I started researching, and I wanted to know more. I found different websites, both Sunni and Shia websites. I continued reading about Imam Hussein, his teachings, the Ahlul Bayt. I listened to speeches by Maulana Rizvi, who was here in Toronto. I was in Texas at the time. Anything I could get my hands on, I would. I had as many books as I could find everywhere. And I would spend countless nights reading, staying up till 2, 3 in the morning, just reading as much as I could about Islam. And at the same time reading the Bible. I had found what that teacher had exposed me to interesting from the perspective that Islam was one of the 3 main monotheistic religions. I had never known that. Other than that, I had been brought up to believe it was a religion from those people over there. People who do not see the face of their wife until they marry her. People who make women walk behind them. And I didn't know a lot about the religion aside from that and the fact that it was a monotheistic religion. Unfortunately, the majority of the Muslims that I came across in university were not very practicing Muslims. So they were not ready to talk about the religion, did not know much about it. As a matter of fact, when I asked to look at the Quran, there was a discussion among several in the house that not to let me look at it because I was Christian, therefore I was najis and I shouldn't touch it. And this went back and forth, and they just were not very knowledgeable people. The research I did, I had to do on my own, whether it was online or through books. I used to refer. In the Bible talks about Jesus prostrating and asking God for forgiveness and guidance. And I used to do that. I would just go on the floor and ask God to guide me and look for anything I could find. I looked at, as I mentioned previously, both Sunni and Shia sources. I studied both concurrently. And Shia Islam called to me because it was logical. There was not only heart, there was mind. Whereas when I would read Sunni sources, I found a lot of contradictions. I found a lot of things that did not entirely sit with me. And that led me away from that path. So asking God for guidance, asking Him to open my heart to the truth and looking for the truth in the Bible. I continuously say I became a Muslim by reading the Bible. When we look at some of the teachings of Jesus, when He says to the people that in vain they worship Him, teaching doctrines of men, that to me said He was not God. Right? He was a prophet. When He talks about the greatest commandment, He's asked, what is the greatest commandment? And He said to love thy Lord with all of thy heart, thy mind, and thy soul, and to love thy neighbor as you love yourself. The rest of prophethood falls on that. So looking at that, if you look at that statement, it's so much like what our teachings are, right? And all of that led to me seeing Islam as a continuum of the previous message, a message that had been adulterated through history. I can say every single area that I looked at in Islam, because it was like being given a handbook for life, how to be successful here and in the hereafter. And I had never been able to get my hands on anything like that. It answered the questions about the unity of God. It answered the questions about prophethood and how prophets were pure. And their stories were what I had read, but they were pure versions of that. It gave you a way of life in every single aspect of your life. So when we look at fiqh and we look at all the rules that we have to live, and then we look beyond that and we look at akhlaq and the treatment of ourselves and others, it was like finding that, perfect fitting sweater that you've always needed to keep you warm and after being cold your whole life. So one of the things about my life is that I didn't find Islam, Islam found me. And it was the same with my reversion. I did not say I'm Muslim now. I gradually became a Muslim in my heart, and it became undeniable. I was driving and I was looking at the sunset was right in front of me. And I remember my heart just pouring with all of the things that I had read in Surah Taha, which is a very, very close surah to my heart. And feeling that I was already a Muslim. All that was left was for me to declare it. So I veered my car. I went to a store that was close to my university, and I knew it was a Muslim store. And it was actually a little grocery store, a halal store, and they had like 2 scarves. So I just chose one, and I took it home. And the next morning, before sunrise, I got up and I declared that I was a Muslim, and I prayed my first salat as a Muslim. I went into my father's room and I told him that I was thinking of becoming a Muslim. He was very supportive. He told me that as long as I had a relationship with God, that was what mattered, and if this was the way that I needed to have it, then that was what he would support. And then he mentioned my mother would be very upset. I told my mother a few days later, and she was devastated. Not so much when I told her I was becoming a Muslim. The first thing she said was, but your parents are Catholic, and your grandparents were Catholic, and your great-grandparents were Catholic. And it reminded me so much of what the Quran talks about, that we will point at each generation before us. And I felt extremely bad in upsetting her so much, but I knew that I had to follow this path. So what I tried to do was to become the best daughter that I could be, to be the gentlest that I could be to her, and to be an example of the teachings of my faith so that she would be able to digest it a little bit easier. 3 months after I became a Muslim and I started wearing hijab permanently. Prior to this, I would wear it everywhere except when I was with my mom. But when I came to the conclusion that it had to be 100%, I told her, and that devastated her more than the news of me changing religions. It wasn't easy for her to stand beside me in public in Texas. It wasn't easy for her to see that her only daughter was now covered. She felt it was a backwards move. She felt I was self-oppressing, and that everything she had taught me to be was now being rejected. She taught me to think for myself. She taught me to be a strong woman. And she felt that by becoming a Muslim and covering myself, I was regressing in everything that her and women of her generation had fought for. Since I had gone through many phases during my childhood and teenage years, I think initially she did feel that way. I know my brothers did. That was very outwardly said. After so many years, I think she has now come to accept that it is a reality and that I will continue being a Muslim. I think she would still feel better if I did not cover my hair. Gradually, she's come to accept the fact that I am a Muslim. As I said previously, she does still struggle with the fact that I dress the way that I do. However, in her heart of hearts, she is a mother and she loves me. So that's one of the things that has really helped our relationship, is that I have stopped talking to her about Islam. Initially, I tried being an example, and I was also verbal about it. I was, a little bit younger and a little inexperienced, and I didn't quite know how to handle it or go about it. I realized that was simply pushing her away. So I became quieter about what my religion teaches and became louder with my actions towards her. And that has made us extremely close. So I think in that way, she's learned to accept the path that I've chosen. My grandmother tells me that I remind her of Mariam, right? So when she sees me, she tells me that I look beautiful just like Mary. And being as religious as she is, my grandmother prays 3 times a day. She gets up, she prays in the morning, she prays at noon, and she prays before bedtime. So I think her deep relationship with God has helped her understand so much more than other people. I think Texas is very diverse, but I think they're not diverse in their thinking as much. I had very strong reactions from my friends. I had a friend call me and ask me why I was wearing this rag on my head and to take it off. I had people who stopped talking to me. I had friends who told me that I needed to stop trying to be an Arab because they didn't understand where it was coming from. They felt they were losing me to something else. And their immediate reaction was to reject whatever I was doing. And I did lose quite a bit of friends. I gained a whole family though. When I first became a Muslim and I became a Shia, there was no alim at the center that was close to me. So there was no one to ask questions of. I would call others in different countries and nobody ever seemed to have time. So it was all on me to study and to research and to learn, and I became used to that. I do go to the masjid, I do listen to lectures. However, I keep my studies. You know, one of the teachings that we have is that we will be questioned in the grave, and anything we learn through hearsay will not be with us, right? So it is our duty to seek out knowledge ourselves. I'm very open to answering any questions that people have. I, for years, mentored teenage girls, teenage Muslim girls, because I felt that part of our work needs to be inside and outside. I find inside our own communities, there's a lot of help that needs to be had, and I mentored them in ways of how to be practicing Muslims in this society. I am currently the only woman in hijab at the company where I work, in all of our locations across Canada. So I'm very active in society within the Muslim community and outside. I do not necessarily go out and do dawah per se. I have spoken at interfaith events. I have given speeches at universities about Islam, and I have mentored our own teenagers as well. When I first started wearing hijab, I was told by some of the Muslim sisters, you will never get a job. So I became the only hijab-wearing teacher in the Dallas Independent School District. When I decided to work for the company that I am currently working at, I was told by Muslim women, take your scarf off for the interview. I did not. I got the job. My job was offered to me 3 hours after my interview. I don't feel we should live by what we fear others think and fear of us. It is all on how we portray ourselves and how we face the world and how we look at it. If I walk into a room feeling lesser than everybody else, everyone will think I'm less. I don't walk in that way. I think hijab is a source of strength, and it is something that is empowering to women. And when we embrace it as such, that is how others perceive us. After I had become a Muslim, I visited the Islamic Center for the first time. And I saw people who I knew from university that I felt were not practicing Muslims, and yet at the Islamic Center they had perfect hijab, and you know, the boys were all very well behaved and nobody was talking to each other, and it was not the picture that I would see every day at school. So that is when I decided to start working with the teens, because I find that is a very volatile age, and it is an age where everything you are gets tested and tried. And I felt if I could just find a way of helping them marry their Muslim self to their North American self, so they wouldn't feel they had to have two separate identities and be, you know, one person at the mosque and a different person out in society, that you can be a strong practicing Muslim in society. And you can only do that by integrating. A message would be, especially for the girls and the women, to integrate into society. We don't always have to be in the background, at home, or researching in a lab without any interaction. We can be CEOs, we can be vice presidents, we can lead departments and be directors. But we cannot do that if we're always hiding or if we feel we're lesser. We have to understand how strong we are. And no one will close doors on you harder than you close them on yourself. So if you're willing to open those doors and walk through them, other people will embrace it. You cannot forget who you worship. The fact that you're going out into society means you're following the example of the strong women in Islam. Zainab was not at home hidden in a corner. Neither was Bibi Fatima. They were out in society. They were working with people. They were teaching people. They were educating. So if we understand that that is part of our Islamic identity and we draw strength from there, we don't have to fear we're going to fall into a place where we don't or should not go to. I find growing up, we always have a generational gap with our parents. But in our Muslim societies here in the West, that gap is widened because it is not only generational, it is also a cultural gap. So an Iraqi 15-year-old girl who was born and raised in Toronto cannot really relate to her mother who was born and raised in Najaf and just got to Toronto 18 years ago, right? So I help to bridge that gap. I give the girls a forum in which they can freely express their thoughts, ask any question they have, because many times they will suppress some of their questions, not ask their parents, and they seek guidance from their friends. And we all know that friends will usually misguide you and misinform you. So I give them a forum in which they can openly speak, openly ask questions, and then we can come to Islam together through logic and through reason. Not because you were born this way or your father feels you need to cover or this is haram and that is halal. We spend a lot of time telling, our children what is halal and what is haram. We never bother reasoning why or what effects these things have on us. So when you come to Islam through reason and through logic, you can pass that message on. And with that foundation, your ground is not shaky when you walk outside. In studying the history of Prophet Muhammad and the way he interacted with Imam Ali, the way he taught him everything, the relationship that he had with him, in reading the hadith of the cloak, it just made sense that Shia Islam was the way that I should take. And it was all solidified when I found out about the time when the Prophet was speaking to the Christians and he invited them to bring their people, and he came only with Imam Ali, Bibi Fatima, Hassan and Hussein. He didn't bring any other companion. He brought his family. His family was the closest to him. His family were the ones that knew everything about him. I love the example when Imam Hassan and Hussein are seeing an older man doing wudu and they want to show him how to make wudu. At such a young age, they were so enlightened in their treatment of others. that it made simple sense that they would be people to follow. So in reading their biographies and in reading their teachings, those things drew me towards Shia Islam. I would then open a book like Sahih Bukhari, and Sahih is, something that should be without error, right? And within one page, there was a contradiction about leather socks. There was 3 different hadiths that were giving complete opposite views. So those things turned me away from Sunni Islam, but even more so were some of the reactions that I saw some of the revered companions have in their own hadiths, right? In their own ways of dealing and treating people. The way they treated Abu Dhar, for example. To me, someone who follows the Prophet would never treat him that way or treat one of his, most loved companions in that manner. I find there is discrimination within our community, which is very sad. We are taught to not be discriminatory at all. We're taught to be welcoming. We are taught to embrace each other as brothers and sisters in Islam. When Malcolm X went to Hajj, he found finally a place where everyone came together as one. Yet we seem to forget that message when we come into our centers and our masjids. I have not experienced that kind of discrimination. I think many times people try to relate to me by explaining things to me that I've known for years, such as, the meaning of Alhamdulillah or MashaAllah. Or they will say hi and bye to me as opposed to, Assalamu alaikum. And part of that is them not quite knowing exactly how to treat me as a Muslim. True discrimination I have seen, sadly, towards, in many instances, not all, towards African Canadian brothers and sisters who can sometimes go into a masjid and not feel welcome at all. And I think that is one of the saddest things to find amongst our community. Our community should be the first to welcome and embrace. Our community should be where everyone can come and feel like they have finally come home. Someone who has left everything they knew, everything their family taught them, and then they come thinking they're going to find a family, and instead they find rejection. I think that is an atrocity, and it definitely needs to be addressed and corrected. The Bilal Center was started by African Canadian converts who felt rejected in every other center, and so they opened that center for themselves. Now it has evolved, and everyone, many people go there. I think it should not be a direction we should take. I think, by that statement, I don't mean the Bilal Center, but I mean, I believe that as Muslims, we should try to desegregate ourselves. You can find Shia Islamic Center every 20 minutes in Toronto, when we could very well be going all to one, having one common prayer, and then if need be to separate by language into different rooms for different speeches, then we could do that. Instead, we open separate mosques every so many miles. I find that sad. Many times we box ourselves in practicing the religion to a point where we can barely function outside in society. And one of the main teachings of Islam is that this message is not brought for us so that we are unsuccessful or distressed. It is for us to achieve success. So we need to find a way of internalizing that message, understanding Islam, and being functional, integrated members of society.